Happy Sabbath. Today is the last in a series of sorts as we've explored some of the beliefs and values that lie at the heart of Garden City Fellowship. We've had a look at some of our values over the last 4 or 5 months. We've talked about our identity. And here this morning, as we conclude, we're going to reflect on what it means for us when we say that we are Seventh-day Adventists. As we discovered last week, there were many different kinds of Adventists that emerged from the Second Great Awakening and the Millerite movement of the mid-1800s. But a large group of them were people who came to be convicted about the importance and relevance of the commandments, including the fourth commandment, remember the Sabbath day. And I know that you all remember because you're here this morning. But this morning I want to talk a little bit more about just getting the day right. I want to talk about what it means when we say that we remember. And I want to explore the things that we should remember when we remember to keep the Sabbath day. Growing up, Sabbath was, for me, mostly a good experience. It was a time when family was around. It was a time when Mum and Dad prepared and cooked the best food. We often had people come and eat with us on a Saturday for lunch. And what followed in the afternoon and evening was often a time of fellowship and relaxing and being together. And so I had a lot of good memories. Sometimes when my dad, who was a preacher, would have to go places to preach, we would travel with him. And so Saturday afternoon often became a bit of an excursion in the car. We would more often than not take the road less travelled. And when in a particular stage of his ministry, he was working out of our head office, Sabbath often meant a weekend away. We would travel to various parts of the conference, and we were together as a family. We got to meet lots of different people, worship in lots of different churches, and made a lot of friends as we travelled around. Sabbath wasn't always the most exciting day. There were certain things that we didn't do, and sometimes as a young person that could get a little bit tedious. There were times when we wanted to read this or play with that or watch something, and as a family we decided that we wouldn't do those things. Of course, as I got older, there was a lot more choice and autonomy about how I remembered the Sabbath day. I remember growing up being in Powerpoints, and one of the taboos at that time was swimming on the Sabbath day. It sounded a little bit too much like fun, and for some reason the Pathfinder Club had this rule, and I guess there were people who felt strongly about it, and probably today around the world there are Adventists who still feel the same way. I remember when I was at college and some of my friends also kind of felt that maybe it was not appropriate sort of activity, that it was too much of seeking your own pleasure or something to that effect. But for me at that time in my life, Sabbath was the one day when I could go swimming. And those times, occasionally, when I found myself there at the beach on a Sabbath afternoon, it was a real blessing to be able to enjoy the water, to relax, and to be mindful of God's presence and His creation. Of course, for some people today, they are abandoning many of the potentially rich and beneficial traditions and values and cultural practices that have been so near and dear to us as Seventh-day Adventists. And of course, some of those centre around the Sabbath and how we keep it. Some of the lifestyle practices and theological beliefs and moral standards are no longer as important for some people. And it's unfortunate because many of them carry a great deal of meaning and have been very important for others in helping to enrich and their experience and ensure that it continues not only in their own lives but in the generations that follow. The church too is vulnerable to the growing secularization of Christianity. And of course, some of the legalistic standards that some of you perhaps grew up with, either as Adventists or other Christians, certainly haven't helped people to embrace and uphold values and principles in their own life and practice. Some are asking, what's the lowest common denominator, the minimum standard required? What can we sort of get away with? How much can we get away with? And whether it's the Sabbath or other principles for which our church stands, slowly some things are being eroded. Rather than seeking to live a life of devotion governed by the highest moral, ethical and spiritual ideals, many are wondering, how much or how little can I get away with? When it comes to the Sabbath, sometimes our focus has been a little too much on whether or not the day is the right day. And of course that's important. It's important to remember the seventh day to get the day right. But there must be more to it than that. Others have focused on the right rules or way in which to keep the Sabbath. And for those of you who perhaps grew up in the Adventist Church 30 or more years ago, maybe 20 years ago, that may have been your experience. For others, they have forgotten the right reasons for keeping the Sabbath day and the right attitude or heart with which we should remember. The Sabbath is an experience to be entered into, not simply a doctrine to be adhered to, a day to be recognised. And it's an experience which should subsequently influence our lives and relationships and faith on a daily basis. Are we more worried about rules than relationships? More worried about heresy than healing? More worried about sleep than service? And it's time, I think, for us to revisit the meaning of the Sabbath and to discover how that can really make a difference in our lives. And I hope to, in this morning's message, to open up some windows that may help you personally to reflect on just how important the Sabbath is and what it means and what a difference it can make in your life as well as in mine. The Bible presents a rich tapestry of stories and theology around the meaning and the practice of us remembering the Sabbath. And it's this rich heritage that I want to expose us to again this morning and to draw upon as we seek to answer the question, what is the point of the Sabbath? Why should we remember it and how should we remember it? And ultimately, what difference can it make in our lives on the other 6 days of the week? So doing, I hope that we'll discover real and meaningful ways in which we can keep the Sabbath within our own context. What we believe and teach really does need to become a part of our worldview, our value system, our attitudes, and importantly, our actions, our behaviour. True Sabbath keeping needs to impact upon our lives, our relationships, and our community, not only the church community, but I would suggest the wider community as well. As I said, the Bible has so much to say about the Sabbath that in order to do justice to it, we would have to present a whole series of sermons. And because we're not going to do that this year, what I want to do is briefly look at quite a number of passages. And in that sense, this morning's sermon is more of a Bible study than a carefully crafted and persuasive message. But I do hope that as Scripture speaks to us this morning, and as I highlight for us some of the important principles and points, that the Scriptures will speak into our hearts as we reflect on why we as a church remember the Sabbath day. My boys have grown up in the video age, and they're familiar, with DVDs and computer games, and they spend far too much time in front of the screen, as I'm sure most parents feel about their own children today. It became quite apparent to me when they were involved in friendly play with some of their friends one day, and in the middle of the game they needed to stop for some reason, and rather than saying the kinds of things that we would have said growing up, like time out, it was pause game. Pause game. Now this is not a game that you pause, it's not a DVD, it's not a computer game, it's real life. Time doesn't stop. Time doesn't stand still. We don't pause life. But nevertheless, that was and continues to be the kind of language that they used. Pause game. Pause game. When it comes to the Sabbath, when we set aside and we take this day, this 24-hour period, which according to the Scriptures we keep from one sunset to the next, we remember to pause. We remember to take time out. We remember to rest from the busyness and rigour of our daily life. Of course, God rested, and one wonders why, because God in His strength and ultimate power shouldn't need to rest, particularly when all He did all week was speak and it was done. Of course, there was the Friday where He carefully formed and molded and crafted Adam and Eve. But one would hardly think that for God that would have been tiresome work. But nevertheless, God rested, because His work was completed. He took a pause and created this memorial in time. Do we rest in what God has done for us? Or are we busy doing? Are we busy trying to carve out our own piece of time in Earth's history when God has already carved out a piece of time that each week we can enter into? We can pause and rest along with Him. Of course, there was the Friday. We can pause at the beginning of our week. We can pause at the end of our week. And so when we remember to pause, our identity grows out of not what we do, but who we are as created beings. We rest in a work already done. The book of Genesis, chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, if you haven't already read it on the screen, says, "The creation of the heavens and the earth and everything in them was completed. And on the seventh day God had finished His work of creation, and so He rested from all of His work. And God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, because it was the day when He rested from all His work of creation." some wonder why there is nothing wrong with setting aside another day as being a holy day for us. Surely we could have a day off, a Sabbath rest on Wednesday or Sunday. And of course the whole branch of Christianity has dedicated itself to that notion. The majority of Christians, in fact. We could set aside Friday as a day to be remembered. And while there's a great deal of value in pausing at any time during the week, and while it's important to remember and honour God at any time, and at all times, in fact, there is only one day that God Himself has blessed and made holy. And I would suggest to us this morning that whenever we seek to make another day that holy and blessed time for us to pause, we are in fact relying upon ourselves and making that a work of righteousness. The Sabbath is not holy because we make it so. It's not holy because we keep it in a particular way. It's holy because God has made it holy. And He has blessed that day. And when we pause and when we rest on that day, we enter into the holiness that God has set aside for us. On the Sabbath, we remember to pause. We remember to rest. And as I think about the creation account, and if you think about it with me for a moment, the first 3 days of the week, God created a space, and on the next 3 days of the week, He filled those spaces with things. On one day, for example, He separated the land and the water, the sky and the sea. And then on the following days, He proceeded to fill those spaces with birds and fish. And on Friday, He populated the land with people. Previously, He filled it with every kind of plant. But the Sabbath is one day which He created as a space, a memorial in time, that everyone in every place, in every age could enter into, not like a memorial, a temple that is built that only those who live in that place can access, but a space in time which any and every person can enter into, but an empty space. And He didn't fill it with anything. He left that space there, that seventh day for us to fill in His worship, to fill in relationship with Him, to connect with one another. And so we remember to pause, we remember to rest, we remember the Sabbath day because God rested, and because God made it holy, and because He invites us to enter into that time and to be with Him. Closely linked, of course, with the creation account is the fourth commandment in Exodus chapter 20. And this verse reminds us that on the Sabbath we remember our Creator. Note what it says: remember to observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. It's already holy, we're going to keep it that way. You have 6 days each week for your ordinary work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath day of rest, dedicated to the Lord your God. The day is about God. When we skip down to verse 9 and 10, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and everything in them, but on the seventh day He rested, and that is why the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and set it apart as holy. On the seventh day, on the Sabbath, we remember our Creator. And as Seventh-day Adventists, I would suggest that it's not possible for us to be true and genuine Sabbath keepers without having the highest regard, not only for worshipping the Creator, but for respecting and protecting and caring for His creation. Adventists as Sabbath keepers should be, by nature, people who are conscious and responsible for the care of their environment, who are stewards of all of the material world, the world in which they live. one of the key verses that is also found in that fourth commandment, which I left out of the next slide deliberately, reminds us that the Sabbath is about remembering our equality before God. When we remember that we have a Creator and that we are creatures, it places every single person on a level playing field. It reminds us that before God, none of us is better than another, more important than another. And the Sabbath commandment reminded us of that and emphasizes it very particularly in verse 10. On that day, no one in your household may do any work. This includes you, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, your livestock, and any foreigner living among you. Now today, the idea of an egalitarian society and a society where people have basic human rights is widely accepted. But if you're like me, you still like to make your kids work. And I still have some kids that are young enough to be gullible when Dad says, "Can you help me please? I would really like a drink." Or, "Can you go and get my phone off the bench for me?" As I lie there on the lounge. It's wonderful. It won't last for too much longer. And so I make the most of that. But back in the time of Israel, as it is in many countries around the world today, there was not this basic egalitarianism, this basic equality between human beings. There were those that were more important. Those that deserved to rest, those that didn't. And so while the owner of the household, and perhaps his wife, or perhaps not, enjoyed the rest of the Sabbath day, the children could be made to continue the work. The servants could be sent to the fields, the livestock could be worked, and if you happen to have some foreigners in your midst, usually, slave labour, they could be put to work as well. And so the Sabbath was a reminder. God specifically states here that on the Sabbath day we're reminded of our equality before God. None is more important, none is exempt, none is excluded. And more than that, regardless of the social standing or status or position that one held in society throughout the week, on at least one day of the week, a person could experience true equality as they rested equally with everybody else. I want to share this quote with you. The Sabbath then testifies to the inclusiveness of the covenant that God has with His people and to the unity of the covenant people. If someone is not free or has lost their freedom, he is reminded on the Sabbath of the freedom which God extended to His people by actually enjoining or instructing such liberation on the seventh day. That is to say, the Sabbath not only insists that people of the covenant be a free people, but it actually liberates them one day a week. And he continues, because the Sabbath is a day of rest, it is uniquely suited to be not only a symbol, but also an agent of the freedom and liberation which God desires for humanity and which we, as God's people, should desire for the world. The Sabbath, therefore, reminds us of our essential equality and value. Our value lies not in what we do, not what our role is through the week, whether we're earning the income, minimum wage or on the pension, or earning 3 figures, 6 figures as a CEO of some company. When we find ourselves here on the Sabbath day, worshipping as Garden City Fellowship, we do so equally before God. Exodus 35 and verse 2. You have 6 days each week for your ordinary work, but the 7th day must be a Sabbath day of complete rest, a holy day dedicated to the Lord. Anyone who works on that day must be put to death. And so we're reminded again that this is a day of rest for everyone. No one should be compelled or forced. And we shouldn't take advantage of that opportunity while allowing others or forcing others to do that work for us. It's a good reminder too when we think about church lunch, by the way. Think of those ladies that faithfully in their most weeks. So it's good for them to have a break regularly so that they can enter into and enjoy the Sabbath rest. How's our clicker going this morning? We have the next slide. Okay. As Sabbath keepers, we remember our deliverance. The book of Deuteronomy gives a second account of the commandments. It's given prior to the entry into the promised land. This is the second time that the commandments have been publicly presented to the Israelite people. And for all intents and purposes, the command itself is the same, but the reason given for observing the commandment is slightly different. You'll recall in Exodus, the reason was looking back to the Creator. But in this particular commandment, the reason given for resting on the Sabbath day is the delivering work that God has done for the people of Israel. Note what the highlighted text there. On that day, no one in your household may do any work. This includes you, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, your oxen and donkeys and other livestock, and any foreigners living among you. All your male and female servants must rest as you do. Okay? Greater emphasis is placed on this particular idea, and when we discover the reason on the next slide, thanks Alan, it becomes plain why. The reason why we're instructed to remember the Sabbath in this passage is because we were once slaves in Egypt. So how then is it right for an Israelite person to allow another person to be a slave and work for them on the Sabbath? You see, remembering what God has done for us should influence the way in which we treat others. And all of us, if we're honest with ourselves, can remember that we too were once slaves of some kind. Slaves to sin, slaves to habits, slaves to addiction, slaves to abusive relationships. We were once slaves, but God has delivered us. He has redeemed us. He has brought us out with His strong hand and powerful arm. And remembering the Sabbath reminds us of His grace and goodness, His deliverance. And so too, we should treat others with that same kind of grace. It also reminds us that regardless of the problems that we continue to face in our lives, that God is there with His strong hand and powerful arm ready to deliver, serve. We remember on the Sabbath the God who saves. That is why the Lord your God has commanded you to rest on the Sabbath day. Thanks, Alan. We remember that God makes us holy. Exodus chapter 31, verse 12 and 13 says, "The Lord then gave these instructions to Moses. Tell the people of Israel, be careful to keep my Sabbath day, for the Sabbath is a sign of the covenant between me and you." Covenant is a promise. It's a relationship built on commitments that two parties make. And of course, the laws that were given in the Ten Commandments were within the context of a covenant relationship that God had established with people, first with Abraham, based on the promises of God. And secondly, before God gave those laws, including the Sabbath, it says, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of bondage." You see, that is the basis of the covenant. Remembering God's commitment and faithfulness and relationship. So the Sabbath then serves as a sign of that covenant, that relationship between God and His people from generation to generation. It is given so that you may know that I am the Lord who makes you holy. All of us desire to live a life that honours God. We want to live in harmony with His principles, His values, His laws. And I spoke earlier in Heart to Heart about some of the practical applications of that. But we always need to remember as Christians that it is in fact God and the work of His Spirit in our lives that brings about the fruit of holiness. Just as we enter into the Sabbath because God has made that day holy, and not because we or any church can make a day holy. So too we remember that our holy lives, our righteousness or our sanctification, as we may call it, is not something that we create or generate ourselves. It is not a work that we can create. But rather it is a regeneration in our hearts and lives by God Himself, by His Holy Spirit. The Sabbath, as we rest on that holy day, reminds us that it is by God's grace and power that we are made holy and able to live a holy life that honours Him. Being chosen, being sanctified, having a special relationship with God, having a special day to remind us of that relationship should lead us to a sense of humility and appreciation for the wonderful grace of God in our lives. The Sabbath too reminds us of our relationship with God, or as I alluded to earlier, our covenant with Him. I think we might have skipped a slide there, Ellen. Thank you. Exodus chapter 31, and we know verse 16 through 17. The people of Israel must keep the Sabbath day by observing it from generation to generation. This is a covenant obligation for all time. It's a permanent sign of my covenant with the people of Israel. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, but on the 7th day He stopped and rested and was refreshed. A permanent sign of a covenant relationship. A few years ago, I think it's about 16 or something like that, I got married. And I entered into a covenant with my wife. It's based on promises and vows that we made on that day. Over the years, we've struggled to keep those vows. We said we would be loving, we'd look after each other, we'd do all these wonderful things. We haven't always kept our side of the deal. But that's what a covenant relationship is. And on that particular, that evening, that wonderful, romantic, some would say faithful evening, that wonderful evening, we exchanged rings. And that ring was a perpetual sign to be worn for all time.